16. Give you a second to look in through your Bibles. The Holy Bible. Other than that, it's not holy. Okay. The word of God, the lecture reading for today says like this. But now they desire a better, that is, a heavenly country. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. May God bless his word.
There we go. Now it's back. It's up. So I have pictures today, thanks to Ian, Cody, and Tammy. We had some technical difficulties, and I guess I'm technologically challenged, and so our pictures almost didn't happen, and we would have to had a longer sermon because, a picture's worth 1,000 words, so I would have had to add a lot of words in place of the pictures. So thank you for the special music, Ian and Ian. Was that a duet or a quartet? It was very nice. And so our opening hymn, "O Brother Be Faithful," if you were here last week, you may remember it from last week's special music. And so Megan and the kids sang that for special music, and I did not. I was at home out of commission with the flu, and so I'm bouncing back, not 100% yet, but back with you. And so as I was considering the special music last week, I think they shared with you that that was one that we became familiar with on a recent trip we took. And so we went to see some friends in Maine. That's the furthest away from home I think I've ever been. And on the way there and back, we saw some Adventist historical sites, some heritage sites. And during one of those, I'll get into more detail here in a little bit, but some of the songs came up that our Adventist pioneers sang. It was interesting, too. At the church we'll talk about first there, the New Hampshire church, he mentioned that they had a book called, I believe it was Hymns and Tunes, and he said that was significant. I never really thought of that, hymns and tunes. He said it because they had tunes with it. I guess prior to that, they had the hymns, the words, but then they had tunes to go with it. And I believe he also said some of the words went with multiple or some of the tunes had multiple words that went with them. So they had a tune that they were familiar with, and then they could have multiple words to go with that. So that was really neat. But as we sang some of those hymns, "O Brother Be Faithful" being one of them, it just really impressed, I think, our whole family, the words, just that you could tell their focus that, of course, Jesus, they expected him to be coming in a matter of years and months as it grew closer, and that's where their focus was. Everything else kind of paled in comparison because he was going to be coming soon, which he is, but they thought, they set the date and thought he's going to be here on that day. So everything, it appears to me, kind of revolved around that, particularly the songs and the message there, and still to this day has a very strong message in it, encouraging us to be faithful and speaking of Jesus' soon return. And so as I mentioned, our trip was to Maine, and a couple of the historical sites. The first one that we saw was the New Hampshire Church, and that's located in Washington, New Hampshire. And it is located down a gravel road, and our picture shrank. What do I do, Ian? There we go. How about that? So there's the sign. Which I'll go into a little more detail with. We were pulling a camper behind the pickup, and so one of my concerns on the trip was, can we get there to these places, and if we get there, can we get out? And this one might have been the most challenging. So it was down a little gravel road, which I think we can all relate to, and there's the sign. And in fact, we learned later, there's the church. Got some more pictures of it. And we learned later, once we got there, I thought it was kind of interesting, they have services there most of the year, the spring, summer, and fall, they have meetings on Sabbath, but not during the winter because the road becomes basically impassable. And so they just kind of, I guess, lock everything up and see it in the spring. So he said you can't even get down the road at times. It's so bad. And there is some property across the road they were talking about that they would like to acquire, and I think they had some plans in mind for that if that were to happen. And then he said, but one of the nice things would be that land's accessible, and then they could access the church year-round without relying on that gravel road. And so that church is currently, it's owned by the Seventh-day Adventist Church, which I thought was kind of neat and interesting. And there's the inside. And so the significance of this church, I learned a lot on our tours. It's considered the first Seventh-day Adventist church. And so we'll kind of backtrack here in a minute on our next stop, but it wasn't the first Adventist church because there was a church prior to that where people, as a result of the Millerite movement, were meeting as Adventists, looking forward to Jesus' second coming. But this was the first Adventist church that started keeping the seventh-day Sabbath. And so you've probably heard the story, but it was really neat because he pointed out they were kind of like us. If you look around week to week, not everybody, it's not etched in the pew or anything, but we kind of sit in the same pews. Harvey and Crystal are usually right here, and everybody's kind of, Loris and Tammy are over there, and Bob and Janice are usually right there, and so everybody's kind of got their designated pews. Well, they were the same way. And so as we were in the church there, our tour guide was just a wealth of information, and he pointed out, and he said, well, William Farnsworth usually sat right here, and his brother sat over here, and Rachel Oakes would usually sit up here, and so he pointed out, and so it's really neat to see where these events, I'd heard of some of them, but it's neat to actually sit there and see where this actually took place and unfolded many, many years ago. And so the significance with the Sabbath is Rachel Oakes, who was a Seventh-day Baptist, she had moved to this area to be near her daughter, Delight Oakes, who was a teacher there in the area. And as I understand it, at one of the meetings, of course they were meeting on Sundays at this time, and they were having communion, and the pastor, he's a Methodist pastor, Frederick Wheeler, he asked, if anybody had any sin in their lives, they needed to, get it out of the way before they took communion. And as our guide expressed it, you hear that she says later when she talks to him, I almost stood up and told you, you need to, yourself, because she was keeping the Sabbath, or had been, but it says they were so focused on the soon return that she wasn't getting a whole lot of attention with that as she was trying to share that. They're like, they were focused, Jesus is coming. They didn't really focus on the Sabbath part. So as they're sitting there, and you can see it's kind of a small area, and he's standing right in front of him, he sees her almost, kind of start to get up. And so he realizes that she had something on her mind. And so as I understand it, later he visited, and that's when she shared with him what she was thinking, and that she almost said, well, you're not keeping the seventh-day Sabbath yourself. And so he went home and I guess studied that out, and eventually he started keeping the Sabbath. And in following weeks, or I'm not sure of the exact time frame, but following that, the Farnsworths, which are another well-named, William Farnsworth, stood up during the service and he said, as for me and my family, we're going to start keeping the seventh-day Sabbath. And then I believe his brother stood up and some more family members, and they all said, we are too. What I found interesting was, I guess they were asked to leave for a while. And and that's something as we saw these sites that becomes apparent. They didn't have it easy back then, the pioneers. They faced a lot of obstacles, a lot of resistance. And in this case, they were meeting in this church, as my understanding, because of the whole Advent movement. And so they were looking to Jesus' soon return. They said he's coming back right away, and there were some other beliefs tied in with that. And the other churches weren't comfortable with that, where they'd been attending. And they said, we'd rather you just didn't, attend church with us. So that's where they started going to this Washington, New Hampshire church. So the same thing kind of happens when they start keeping the Sabbath, when these few members say, we're going to keep the seventh-day Sabbath. Well, the rest of the congregation, they weren't seeing it yet. And they're like, well, that's okay if you want to do that. Why don't you just do that at home? And so my understanding is they actually left for a little while, and then I don't know exactly what happened, but the rest of the congregation kind of dwindled over time. And then this group wound up coming back to this church and holding their services there on Sabbath. And so that's why it's recognized as the first Seventh-day Adventist church. And so that was, like I say, really neat to observe that. And you can tell it's, to back up there for a minute, you can tell there is heat there. Got a picture of that in a minute. But it's not as comfortable as our church, I don't believe, because we don't have the blankets and afghans draped over our pews here that I see. So they're prepared for maybe using those for cushions as well. I don't know, but to keep warm. So hanging on the walls, they did have some interesting things. This was one of them. It was a flyer back in the time. You know, we print out posters now and pass them out in the communities. Well, back then, I guess they made them out of linen, so they'd be durable. And I believe this is one of those linen flyers, and they would roll them up. And so it was quite a undertaking to make one of those. You know, you just didn't get a computer and print it out, which I even struggle with that. But they had to actually, you know, very time-consuming, kind of a work of art to make these. There's the heater, the inside of it. I think our kids were fascinated with that, so I believe one of them might be responsible for these photos. They had 2 of these stoves, and they did produce some heat. When we got there, he turned them on, and we were chilled for a while, but eventually we started warming up. There's another picture from the outside. And this is a Bible. It's not the Bible that Ellen White held in her hand during a vision, but he said it's very similar. I believe somebody donated it, maybe like a family Bible or something, but you can see that's pretty hefty. Even the cover is pretty thick in and of itself. And so it's kind of neat to see, get an idea of what that would have been like. And what else do we have? There's another flyer or banner. And they have the organ, which works, and they use during their services. There's the cemetery outside, and a lot of the people we've heard of, like there's Williams Farnsworth's headstone. Very interesting. There's the church again. They also have a Sabbath trail there. You can kind of see over to the side, that stone to that side, where you go through the woods. It's kind of a work in progress. They have stones throughout it. They're all commemorating creation, so different scriptures and such. So it's very nice. And my picture's stuck. Our next stop was the William Miller Farm. And so I'm sure you've heard of this. There we all are out in front. And so that is also currently owned by the Seventh-day Adventist Church, and they've restored it. I think it did change hands a few times. Mostly it was in the Miller family, but then some other people did have it for a period of time, and then the church got it. So they restored it to try to make it look like what it looked like during the time that William Miller lived there. It's pretty close, not exact, they told us. There's some pictures of the inside. Our tour guide there. Desk. Again, I don't know that the furniture is the exact same furniture like that he would have sat on when he did his Bible studies, but if not, it's a lot like it that's been donated from the same time period. So that's kind of neat to think of him studying the Bible. And again, you know, Harvey's mentioned when we prepare for sermons today, we can do a lot of it just on our phone. You can, you know, pull up Bibles and resources and everything. But not back then. He had to get out the ink quill and the big Bibles and the commentaries and lay that all out there and study. And I'm sure they didn't have a lot of free time because, you know, when they had to go get some water, you can see how they did that. They just didn't turn on the tap. They had to pump their water, so it wasn't like they were sitting around with a lot of free time. So they had to make an effort to do those studies, I'm sure. Also, this is outside of the house. The trees there are the maple grove. And you may have heard, if you've heard the story of William Miller, when I believe his nephew came and asked him to come share the message of what he'd been studying at their church, and he wrestled with God. He didn't want to do it, did he? And he went out to the maple grove, and that's kind of where I think he prayed and kind of wrestled with God, and eventually came to peace with it and said, okay, I'll go. They said a lot of the little trees probably weren't there, but there's a few big ones that they said probably were there when he went out and prayed in the maple grove. And we're pumping some water again. And Ian said just swipe and it'll go, but it's... And this is Ascension Rock, so I'm sure you've heard of that. They said it wasn't like, sometimes different accounts, you hear different stories on it. It wasn't packed. They said there were probably some community members around that got together on that day and went out to, watch the sky for Jesus' return. But it was a lot smaller than I think, at least what I had heard at times. It was really neat, again, to see that and to think, this is the exact same spot where some people were standing watching the sky looking for Jesus' return. And the rock itself is pretty neat, too. And they said, in fact, in that community, it attracts people that not necessarily Adventist or related to the Advent movement in any way. They just think, hey, it's a nice spot to come relax and look at nature. And so it's turned into kind of a witness to the community, I believe, just from that geological formation there. This is a chapel. It's the William Miller Chapel. And the Ascension Rock is just behind that, so it's all kind of in a somewhat small area there. And this was built towards the end of William Miller's life. In fact, they said, I don't think he he may have attended a little bit, but they said he was pretty much sitting in the house looking out the window while it was being built. His health was declining at that time. But again, it's kind of like I shared earlier about the Washington church. He really wasn't welcome in the church where he'd always attended after everything unfolded and took place. And the people that kept attending the church where he had went, they really didn't encourage him to come. So they built the chapel as a place for like-minded believers to attend. And keep in mind, this was prior to the Sabbath being accepted and everything, so this was more the Adventist church. And it is currently it's jointly owned by the Seventh-day Adventist and the, forgot the name. I wrote it down, but it's Adventist. It was a result of the Millerite movement, but they weren't Seventh-day Adventists, but they worked together to maintain it, and they do hold meetings there throughout the year also. The Advent Christian Church is the name of that denomination, which they said initially started out pretty good sized, and the Seventh-day Adventists were small, and then over time it's kind of reversed. So there's still a few left, but they've kind of shrank in number, and the Adventist group has grown, and so I believe they both hold like annual meetings there, and they said the Adventist group has outgrown the chapel, and so they're outside holding the meetings when they go. So again, it's kind of neat to see that. And so I'm getting ahead of myself there with the pictures. So regarding the trip, I wanted to share a little bit about that with you too. So we pulled the camper, as I mentioned earlier, and we've had some trips in the past, which I may have shared with you, where we pulled them with a Suburban. And those went okay, but we had a few difficulties during that, a breakdown or two. And so in the meantime, we acquired a pickup. And so I said, wow, we're going to be smooth sailing now. It does handle the camper very nicely, and it's a diesel pickup. And after I got it, I got to reading about it. And evidently, and Harvey can confirm this, I've talked to him about it, it has the engine in it has the worst reputation probably of any diesel engine ever made for breaking down. And so I haven't had any trouble with it, but in light of the things I was reading, and in light of my conversations with Harvey and others, I was just expecting it to break down before we got out of the driveway. And so we had a nice trip, but I've got this kind of black cloud hanging over us in the back of my mind at least. I'm just waiting for the engine to blow up. And hopefully not while we're in Maine, because I'm thinking, how are we going to get back? I got the family to get back, we got the camper to get back. We can leave the pickup, I guess, if it just disintegrates. But so that was the scenario in my mind. And kind of on the trip, I don't know if I wanted to admit it or not, but I feel like this was a constant reminder of our need for God, our dependence on Him during the trip. And of course, that's daily. But what I mean by that is, if everything had been perfect, if Harvey had said, oh yeah, that truck, that engine's bulletproof, you won't have to worry about that, it's not going to break down, I'd have said, oh yeah, we're going to make it there and back because of the quality of this truck, but that wasn't the case at all. I thought, well, it doesn't have too many miles, but it's got a horrible reputation. Lord, please hold it together. And so that was kind of encouraged our daily dependence on Him during that. And so in light of that, kind of setting the stage for this, we're headed back home to skip ahead a little bit. We've seen these sites. We're coming back home. We're ready to cover some ground at this point, get back on the interstate. We've been on some back roads in New York, which is very scenic, very pretty, but it's time to cover some ground. And so I follow the phone, Google and Apple Maps there tells me where to go and where to turn. And so I'm watching that, And we get on the interstate, and I think, boy, it's just time to sit back and go. And this is how it usually happens. I'm thinking, truck's done pretty good. I think we're going to make it. It hasn't missed a beat here. And so all of a sudden, Google says, or Apple says, turn here. And so I turn, and next thing I know, I'm on a back street. It's kind of like we're driving through downtown Holden or someplace. And I said, what is going on? I expected the roads to just get bigger and bigger, and we could really just turn it loose and sail home. And so we're in this little town, and we're driving, and we turn on another little street, and we're going down Main Street. And Megan said, I feel like we're about to make some memories. Because that's usually what happens when we start taking turns like that. We make some memories, not always good. And so we're doing that, and so we leave town, and we're out on the highway, not the interstate, but we're on a 2-lane highway, and we're doing good. So I kind of relax again, and we hit up this little hill, little grade, not too steep. And all of a sudden, the most terrible noise you've ever heard comes out from the front of the truck. It sounded like air hissing, and it was awful. And Megan said, what happened? Did a tire blow out? And I said, no, I think the engine blew up. I think we're done. And we were still in New York at this point. And I said, I'm just thinking, we're not going to get off the side of the road. There's going to be probably antifreeze and oil and everything trailing behind us. And there's a little gas station off to the side. And so we pull into that, and I jump out, and I look underneath, and there's nothing. Don't see any antifreeze, don't see anything. And so I pop the hood, and I look under there, and I heard a slight noise. It sounded odd. It sounded like it's coming from behind the radiator. And I look, another guy comes over, and he offers to help. I don't know. I says, making an awful noise a minute ago. Well, it's not now, no. And so you can't do much with something that you can't find. So I put the hood down, and we eke out back on the road. And when I give it a little gas, it start whining. I said, oh, that doesn't sound good. We're done. And so Megan's Googling on the map, and she found a repair shop, Frank's Big Toe Repair Shop or something like that. So how far away is it? She said, well, 15 minutes. Okay, let's pray we can make it. And so we're praying, and we're squeaking down the road, and we pull into Big Frank's Repair Shop, and it has a long driveway, and then kind of an old building set back there. And so I go inside, and I find the mechanic, and short story is he comes out and takes a look. He crawls underneath there, and I hear the noise kind of change. I look around, he's putting his finger on something. I thought, well, that's a good sign. At least he can get to it. It's not inside the engine. And so wound up being a hose clamp on a big old hose that goes to the turbo, and it had just failed, and the hose blew off, and that's where our noise was coming from. So he puts a new hose clamp on there, and we're back on our way. And so it was a minor breakdown, which we were very thankful for. But even that, you know, we look back on it, and even at the time we said, we were so thankful we weren't on the interstate, we're on a little side road, we were able to pull off. We find our way to this little repair shop, didn't even have to unhook the camper, there's plenty of room to pull in. This gentleman was gracious enough to come out, take a look, fix it real quick. You know, this could have turned into a days-long event at some places just trying to get it looked at. And so we felt like God really took care of us, even with this minor breakdown. And I also feel like, you know, if something major had happened, it didn't, and I'm thankful for that. I think of the saying, you know, God doesn't give us more than we can handle, and I don't know that I could have handled a major breakdown at that point. The little one about did me in. But I feel like if it had, you know, God would have taken care of us. He would have provided, and I don't know how, but He knows how. And so it really served to strengthen our faith in Him, to choose to look at it that way and see how He does take care of us. But at the same time, I thought, you know, not only on the trip, I enjoyed the trip, but I could have enjoyed it a whole lot more if I could have just relaxed and not have worried about breaking down and what are we going to do and things like that. And I thought, I know for myself in my daily life, I feel like I limit God sometimes with my negative expectations, my doubts and fears. You know, I think, what if this happened? You know, the Bible really encourages us not to do that, just to trust God. Just He'll take care of the rest. We just should live one day at a time and do what He asks us to do and leave the rest of it in His hands. And so I'd like to share another similar situation with you. And these kind of made me think of, you know, we've talked recently about God's intervention. I think Ian's preached some sermons with him and the elk and God's intervention. And I feel like this was another, looking back, divine intervention. You know, God's intervening in our lives constantly. I know on this trip, who knows how many times that He intervened. We won't know until we get to heaven and He can show us. And that's the way with our daily lives. He's intervening constantly, things that we take for granted and don't even realize. And so in this situation, we were back on the road again. And what we did, we had the camper in the truck. And so most of the time, we would just find a truck stop along the way, and we'd pull into a space and crawl in the camper, had our bedroom with us, and go to sleep, and then head out the next morning. And so the further east we got, the harder it was to find truck stops. They don't have them like we do back here, at least not that I saw. And so they were smaller and further apart. And so I looked on the map, and I had one planned out. So this looks like a good place to stop, and it'd be about the right time of day. And so we're sailing down the road, and I went past a sign, and I realized shortly thereafter that that was my exit. I missed it. And so I said, well, maybe we should just go on to the next one. Well, all things considered, we decided, no, we better head back to that one because I don't know when we're going to find another one. So we head back. Well, by this time, I was starting to learn the trend. As the sun goes down, the trucks start pulling over and parking. And if you wait too long, there's no parking spot. And so we pulled in, and it was dark, and we circled the parking lot, and I saw a couple of semis circling too, and I thought, that's not good. And so didn't see any space at all. So, well, we probably just should pull back out and go try to find someplace else. And so I said, well, let's circle one more time. And I really didn't think there was any spot. It wasn't that big. It was like an L shape, and you could see all the sites, or kind of a C shape, I guess. And you could see all the sites, and they were full. And so we circled one more time on our way out, and I looked, and in the corner there was one spot. I think it was the only spot in the truck stop at that time. And there was a reason it was the only spot. It was tight. And so a semi, I don't think it would have been possible for them to have backed in there the way it was situated. I don't really know why they painted it that way. It was like there were parking places this way, and there were parking places this way, and they overlapped. And so if they were parked up this way, they couldn't get in there. But we were small enough, so we were able to squeeze right in there and get in that spot. Now, my next concern was, what if somebody pulls in? There was a shorter truck next to us, and I said, what if they pull out in the middle of the night and the big semi backs in? We're not going anywhere in the morning until they get ready to go somewhere. But that didn't happen either. So once again, God was taking care of us. Didn't need to worry as much as I did. And so on this trip, we did a lot of driving. And the kids can vouch for that. We drove and we drove and we drove. And it was a long trip for our family, and it took quite a bit of preparation to get ready. We had to pack all our stuff in the camper. We had to plan out our route, decide where we're going. And so as I was thinking about that, it made me think, we've got another big trip coming up as a church family, as God's family, don't we? God's coming to take us to heaven soon. And so we need to prepare for that trip. And so as I was thinking about that, and I mentioned we looked at the routes, we pulled up Google Maps and said, here's our destination, here's where we're at, how do we get there? One route took us right through the middle of New York City. And Megan said, well, that goes through, I don't know, was it Vermont? She said, I've never been to Vermont. Maybe we should go that route. That'd be scenic. I said, no, look over here. It goes right through the middle of New York City. I've never been to New York City, and I don't think we should go. And so we had to consider where these routes went, how the best way was to get there. So I pulled a few quotes, reason being, it's said much better and much more eloquently than my rambling, and so I feel like it's more beneficial to read these quotes. Most of them came from the book Heaven. It's a compilation of Ellen White's quotes. And so this quote says, there are not many ways to heaven. Each one may not choose his own way, like we did with our trip. Christ says, I am the way. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. Since the first gospel sermon was preached, when in Eden it was declared that the seed of the woman should bruise the serpent's head, Christ had been uplifted as the way, the truth, and the life. He was the way when Adam lived, when Abel presented to God the blood of the slain lamb, representing the blood of the Redeemer. Christ was the way by which patriarchs and prophets were saved. He is the way by which alone we can have access to God. So the good news is we don't have to get out Google Maps and try to figure out how to get to heaven. There's only one way, and that's Jesus Christ. Another quote says, many are losing the right way in consequence of thinking that they must climb to heaven, that they must do something to merit the favor of God. They seek to make themselves better by their own unaided efforts. This they can never accomplish. Christ has made the way by dying as our sacrifice, by living as our example, and by becoming our great high priest. He declares, I am the way, the truth, and the life. If by any effort of our own we could advance one step toward the ladder, the words of Christ would not be true. But when we accept Christ, good works will appear as fruitful evidence that we are in the way of life, that Christ is our way, and that we are treading the true path that leads to heaven. So as I mentioned, we had to drive a lot on our trip. The good news about going to heaven, we don't have to drive to get there. How are we going to get there? This quote says, Christ has declared that he will come the second time to gather his faithful ones to himself. Then all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he shall send his angels with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So he will send his angels to get us, won't he? To take us to heaven. Now on our trip, it cost a little bit. We had to buy diesel to put in the truck. We had to pay toll roads. We don't have a lot of those around here, but they have a lot of those back east. The further east we went, the more toll roads we saw. And they're kind of surprise toll roads, in my opinion. You just see the sign that says, we'll send you a bill. And I thought, oh boy, I wonder how much of a bill we're racking up here as we travel. And in fact, it hasn't been too bad. But every once in a while in the mail, we get a little bill to remind us of our trip, a little souvenir. And I think within the last month or so, we even got one. Our trip was in the fall, by the way, in October. So even in the last month, we got another bill for like $4 or something for, I don't remember, New Hampshire or someplace. So it did cost to go on the trip. So what's the cost of the trip to heaven? A quote says, never can the cost of our redemption be realized until the redeemed shall stand with the Redeemer before the throne of God. Then, as the glories of the eternal home burst upon our enraptured senses, we shall remember that Jesus left all this for us, that he not only became an exile from the heavenly courts, but for us took the risk of failure and eternal loss. Our goal is to get to heaven, isn't it? I mean, that's one thing that we're really looking forward to. Christ left all that to come down here for us. Then we shall cast our crowns at his feet and raise the song, worthy is the Lamb that was slain to receive power and riches and wisdom and strength and honor and glory and blessing. And another quote says, I saw the beauty of heaven. I heard the angels sing their rapturous songs, ascribing praise, honor, and glory to Jesus. I could then realize something of the wondrous love of the Son of God. He left all the glory, all the honor which he had in heaven, and was so interested for our salvation that he patiently and meekly bore every indignity and slight which man could heap upon him. He was wounded, smitten, and bruised. He was stretched on Calvary's cross and suffered the most agonizing death to save us from death, that we might be washed in his blood and be raised up to live with him in the mansions he is preparing for us, to enjoy the light and glory of heaven, to hear the angels sing, and to sing with them. We kind of talked about that in Sabbath school this morning. When he was here on earth and he was tempted by Satan, he left heaven. He didn't have to do that. He came down here and endured that for us. And as I was reading those quotes, the following quote I thought was really interesting, and we kind of talked about that in Sabbath school this morning too. It says, by his life and his death, Christ has achieved even more than recovery from the ruin wrought through sin. It was Satan's purpose to bring about an eternal separation between God and man. So you think about Satan's goal. He wanted to drive a wedge in there to separate us from God, to get us further away from him, didn't he, with sin and temptation. But that kind of backfired on him. It says, in Christ, we become more closely united to God than if we had never fallen. In taking our nature, the Savior has bound himself to humanity by a tie that is never to be broken. Through the eternal ages, he is linked with us. God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. He gave him not only to bear our sins and to die as our sacrifice, he gave him to the fallen race. To assure us of his immutable counsel of peace, God gave his only begotten Son to become one of the human family, forever to retain his human nature. You know, that change was permanent. He died, he was resurrected, but he took on the form of humanity, and that changed him forever. This is the pledge that God will fulfill his word. Unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder. So before we went on our trip, we set our alarm because we didn't want to wake up early and get a late start on the day we were heading out, and even during our trip. So do we need to set our alarm to be ready to go to heaven? We don't want to miss it, do we? So I found the following quote related to that. Amid the reeling of the earth, the flashing of lightning, and the roaring of thunder, the voice of the Son of God calls forth the sleeping saints. He looks upon the graves of the righteous. Then, raising his hand to heaven, he cries, Awake, 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 ye that sleep in the dust, and arise. Throughout the length and breadth of the earth, the dead shall hear that voice, and they that hear shall live. And the whole earth shall ring with the tread of the exceeding great army of every nation, kindred, tongue, and people. From the prison house of death they come, clothed with immortal glory, crying, O death, where is thy sting? O grave, where is thy victory? And the living righteous and the risen saints unite their voices in a long, glad shout of victory. I don't think we need to worry about setting our alarm clock. I think he'll wake us up when it's time, don't you? Well, when we do wake up, are we going to wake up kind of sleepy-headed and groggy? And, on our trip, we got kind of tired, and some mornings it's a little hard to roll out of bed even when the alarm went off. Well, it says, all come forth from their graves, the same in stature as when they entered the tomb. Adam, who stands among the risen throng, is of lofty height and majestic form, in stature but little below the Son of God. He presents a marked contrast to the people of later generations. In this one respect is shown the great degeneracy of the race. But all arise from their last deep slumber with the freshness and vigor of eternal youth. No sleepyheadedness there, huh? In the beginning, man was created in the likeness of God, not only in character, but in form and feature. Sin defaced and almost obliterated the divine image, but Christ came to restore that which had been lost. He will change our vile bodies and fashion them like unto his glorious body. The mortal, corruptible form, devoid of comeliness, once polluted with sin, becomes perfect, beautiful, and immortal. All blemishes and deformities are left in the grave. The redeemed bear the image of their Lord. Oh, wonderful redemption, long talked of, long hoped for, contemplated with eager anticipation, but never fully understood. So we saw some friends on our trip. Got another picture here for you. Oh, by the way, we drove a lot, and we even found Kingsville, Pennsylvania. We saw the sign. We said, there's Kingsville. Well, we were still a long ways from home when we saw that. So when we got there, this is the family that we went to visit, and we hadn't seen them for years. I think we talked to them a time or two, maybe texted, but we hadn't seen them in person for I don't know how many years, several. But you know what? As soon as we saw them, we recognized them. We knew who they were. Well, how about when we get to heaven? Will we recognize friends and family there? The resurrection of Jesus was a type of the final resurrection of all who sleep in him. The countenance of the risen Savior, his manner, his speech, were all familiar to his disciples. As Jesus arose from the dead, so those who sleep in him are to rise again. We shall know our friends, even as the disciples knew Jesus. If you think about it, we read in the Bible, they knew him when he came back, didn't they? As Jesus arose from the dead, they may have been deformed, diseased, or disfigured in this mortal life, our friends and family, but they rise in perfect health and symmetry, yet in the glorified body their identity will be perfectly preserved. Then shall we know, even as we are known. In the face, radiant with the light shining from the face of Jesus, we shall recognize the lineaments of those we love. That was a new word to me, lineaments. So I looked that up, and it's defined as an outline, a feature, or a contour of a body or figure, and especially of a face. Or it's also defined as a distinguishing characteristic or feature. So when we get to heaven and we see those friends and family, they're still going to look familiar. We're going to recognize them. God's greatest gift is Christ, whose life is ours, given for us. He died for us and was raised for us that we might come forth from the tomb to a glorious companionship with heavenly angels, to meet our loved ones and to recognize their faces. For the Christ-likeness does not destroy their image, but transforms it into his glorious image. Every saint connected in family relationship here will know each other there. Well, I mentioned when we traveled, see if I can get back to that picture, we stayed in the camper, so we kind of winged our way across the United States there. But we knew when we got to our friend's house, we definitely had a place to stay. We knew that they had a big yard and a big house, and we'd be able to park the camper, and we'd be able to stay with them. What about heaven? Do we have reservations waiting for us there? It says, how great will be the joy when the redeemed of the Lord shall all meet, gathered into the mansions prepared for them. Oh, what rejoicing for all who have been impartial, unselfish laborers together with God in carrying forward his work in the earth. What satisfaction will every reaper have when the clear, musical voice of Jesus shall be heard, saying, Come, ye blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. And I thought this was a neat comparison. It says, we have his promise. We hold the title deeds to real estate in the kingdom of glory. Never were title deeds drawn up more strictly according to law or signed more legibly than those that give God's people a right to the heavenly mansions. Let not your heart be troubled, Christ says. Ye believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you, and if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there ye may be also. So what will heaven be like? Words are inadequate to describe it, but the Holy Scriptures give us a glimpse of the glorious future. There all will be harmony, peace, love, and unity. All will be purity, holiness, and blessedness. Gone will be sorrow, crying, and pain. And best of all, death will be no more. I thought that summed it up pretty good in that quote there. And I've always thought, I think heaven, the Bible gives us glimpses of what it will be like. But I think it's so foreign to us because we're so used to this world and the sin and the degradation and everything that's taken place in this world that I think it's hard for us even to imagine what it'll be like. But the main thing is Jesus is going to be there. I think we know that's going to be the best part of all. And he's got more wonderful things planned for us than we can even imagine. As a closing thought, I found this quote that says, "We must have a knowledge of the Scriptures that we may trace down the lines of prophecy and see that the day is approaching, so that with increased zeal and effort we may exhort one another to faithfulness." Kind of like our song a while ago, our hymn, "Oh, Brother, be faithful." Give up our faith, lose our confidence, become impatient? No, we will not think of such a thing. See how the specifications of the prophecies have been and are fulfilling. That's kind of like we've talked about before. You can look at the prophecies, and there's no way to miss it, no way to deny it. We're getting closer. The prophecies are being fulfilled more and more. Let us lift up our heads and rejoice, for our redemption draweth nigh. It is nearer than when we first believed. Shall we not wait patiently, filled with courage and faith? Shall we not make ready a people to stand in the day of final reckoning? So let's stay faithful. Let's encourage one another, as mentioned here. And as our final hymn, we've got another one that we heard on our trip, which is Never Part Again. And he shared with us, too, that was, I believe, William Miller's favorite hymn. And is that right? I think so. And I think they even said kind of during his final days, he found comfort in when his family and friends would sing that to him. And they said that kind of used to be the Adventist sort of theme song. They said now it's kind of changed to We Have This Hope, but it used to be Never Part Again. And as we sing it,